Chapter 13. Life in the Sea Org. Becoming part of the Sea Org was never something I was overjoyed about doing. I knew it could be a rough ride. I had been around Sea Org members at St. Hill and in Clearwater since the early 1970s. I knew that sometimes Sea Org members were not paid their weekly allowance. I knew that the discipline was strict and that a Sea Org member's life was controlled to a great extent. I had been self-employed for my entire working life. I sold insurance for a time, then I had my cookware sales. As a musician, I would receive calls to play gigs, which I could accept or not. In other words, my schedule had always been my own. I was a free spirit and an entrepreneur. This, I knew, would change when I joined the Sea Organization. At the same time, they really helped me in my time of need. I guess you could say that I felt obligated. So out of a sense of duty more than anything, I packed my things and drove to Los Angeles in the early summer of 1985. I knew I could offer my service and help other people and contribute to a group that had the purpose of making a better world. The church headquarters in Los Angeles is located near the corner of Vermont Avenue and Sunset Boulevard. Purchased by the church in 1977, it was the former site of the Cedars of Lebanon Hospital. The primary Scientology organizations in Los Angeles are still located in the complex, and the former main building of the hospital serves primarily as living quarters for Sea Org staffers who work at the complex. David got me a decent room in the building, and I stayed there while I did my orientation and introductory training. Other new recruits lived in dorms that often were overcrowded. I don't deny that being the father of the leader of the church had its advantages, at least in the beginning. And make no mistake, even though Hubbard was still alive, he was in seclusion, and David was the one directing the church. During that period, Dave was spending a lot of time in Los Angeles. After the protest in Portland, another legal case was heating up in Los Angeles, and David wanted protests there as well, to draw attention to the injustice, as he saw it. Because we were both living at the church complex then, we used to meet after work and shoot the breeze. Things between us were still great. Several weeks after joining, I was brought up to the Hemet base as a new staff member for Golden Era Productions. Gold, as it is known, produces all the training films, lectures, and marketing materials for Scientology organizations around the world, and it provides support services for the management entities that operate from there. Top church management is also located on the base, so the entire compound is referred to as Gold, or INT, meaning International Headquarters, or just the base. It is all the same facility. As I've mentioned, the facility formerly was the popular Massacre Canyon Inn Resort in Gilman Hot Springs. Hollywood glitterati took mineral baths in the spa, played golf on its course, and partied in the 1950s and 1960s. Then an earthquake shut off the springs feeding the spa, and people found other places to vacation. By 1978, the place was all but shut down, and Hubbard authorized its purchase. The idea was to use it as a base during the summer, when the desert heat in La Quinta made that place basically uninhabitable, and then return to La Quinta during cooler weather. That plan never materialized, and by spring 1979, just about all of the 100 or so staff from La Quinta had moved to the new facility. The property was large, more than 500 acres, resting right up against the San Jacinto Mountains, a few miles north of Hemet. At the time of purchase, the facility had been defunct for some time. Buildings consisted of the old spa, the Massacre Canyon Inn restaurant, a tavern, the U.S. Post Office for Gilman Hot Springs, a variety of bungalows and room for guests, as well as various maintenance buildings. Work crews got busy renovating the rundown facilities and repurposing spaces for church management offices and multimedia productions. Since the 1960s, Hubbard had wanted to produce training films for students learning to become auditors. Western culture had grown more visually oriented, he reasoned, and he saw that being able to demonstrate various aspects of how to use the e-meter or proper communication protocols would be useful to students. Hence, his desire to script and shoot these films. Over the years, new construction has carried on more or less continuously, and 9 holes of the golf course have been resurrected. Today, the place is a well-kept, sparkling facility among the otherwise drab dairy farms and horse ranches that make up most of the Hemet Valley. The central compound consists of about 50 buildings and includes a large film studio, a film processing plant, film and video editing bays, several audio recording studios, a lavish music studio, administrative offices for Scientology's international management, as well as maintenance facilities. In addition, it has other sports facilities and quarters that house everybody who works there. Everything is top of the line and matches in architectural design. Hubbard said the setting reminded him of the Scottish Highlands, so all the buildings follow a Scottish motif, with white buildings trimmed in blue and with blue slate roofs. Hubbard was interested and involved from afar in the property renovations. He never lived at the new base, and after his death in 1986, David ensured that building continued. To safeguard the millions of dollars worth of equipment as well as the staff who live there, a fence with motion sensors, cameras, and spotlights surrounds the central compound. The fence is topped with razor wire, ostensibly to keep intruders out. However, the spikes point inward, which rather indicates that the fence is meant to keep the staff in, with the sensors and cameras to alert the security guards to anyone trying to escape. Several times the church has attempted to no avail to close State Route 79, which bisects the property. Cameras continually record passing traffic to provide evidence in case of people harassing the base. When I arrived in early summer 1985, the beginning phase of renovations was more or less completed, and the number of staff had grown from a couple hundred to 2 or 3 times that. The old Massacre Canyon Inn, MCI, became the base dining facility. Eventually, the place could no longer hold the entire staff, so mealtimes were broken into shifts, with managers seated for one shift and the Golden Era Productions staff eating at another time. Because I was a musician, I was posted to Gold's music department as a horn player and arranger. Music was considered an important aspect of Gold. It was part of every training film or video production. Everything we produced on the base went out to the rest of the Scientology world, so it was important that it be right. And, of course, the standards were high. The Golden Era musicians, as we were called, consisted of drums, congas and percussion, bass, guitar, keyboards, a horn section with clarinet, saxophone, trombone, and me on trumpet or cornet, as well as a vocalist. Much of the music we produced began as ideas from L. Ron Hubbard, who years before had created melodies for various training films. We took those single-note melodies and put chords to them. After that, we did arrangements and submitted these to David for approval. Upon approval, we would use the piece as the title song for a film, and then write other pieces that integrated with that title piece. Film music cannot draw attention to itself, but has to support the film and forward its message. We were walking a fine line, but when it worked, it was plain to see. Today, when I watch a movie or television show, I can easily spot when a piece of music is working or not. One of my first assignments at Gold was making an album with Edgar Winter, based on Hubbard's Mission Earth series of novels. I had never met a musician as competent as Edgar. He is an excellent writer, a superb musician, and a fine singer. He can do it all. His knowledge of music theory and harmony is outstanding. He's one of the most creative people I've ever met. That project turned out well. Edgar told me about playing gigs with his brother Johnny, another fabulous musician. One time they had a gig at some club way out in the Texas boonies. They drove for hours to get to the place. When they arrived, all they found was the charred outline of the club. It had burned down the previous day, literally to the ground. Later that year, I came out of the music studio at Gold one day and spotted Dave some distance away with an entourage of 3 or 4 people. I called out, "Hey, Dave," to get his attention. He turned around and didn't say a word, but he shot me a glare that said, "Who the hell do you think you are yelling after me like that? Do you know who I am?" Right then was the first indication that my son had changed dramatically. Our relationship was not father-son anymore. He was no longer my son, but the head of the Church of Scientology, and that look let me know it. The church and its operations took precedence now, and would from then on out. That look of his made a considerable impression on me. My role in the Sea organization would have nothing to do with being his father. I thought to myself, well, I better not do that again. It was not the last time something like that would happen. His attitude worsened over the years, but that incident was the first time I encountered it. I remember one time in particular when the Golden Era musicians were at St. Hill for a big event in the early 2000s. I was standing backstage with Dave. Nearby was a well-known Italian pop star who was not a Scientologist, but had agreed to do the concert because he supported the church's humanitarian programs. The Gold musicians performed their show and then played dance music for the rest of the evening. I had walked off stage for a break, and not 15 feet away from me and Dave was the pop star, standing with a woman who worked for the church and acted as his handler, along with 2 other people. David began to dress me down in a tirade that lasted nearly a full hour. The man and his contingent could hear everything as David yelled, cursed me out, and generally ripped me apart. I was totally and utterly mortified by the entire experience. The head of the Church of Scientology, ripping his own father apart within earshot of others. I went numb when he began, but what I can recall was that he was upset at how incompetent we all were, how we couldn't do anything right, and blah, 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 punctuated frequently with mother blank, blank sucker, and all the rest. Meanwhile, the others stood stiff as boards, never turning around, and pretended that it wasn't happening. Had they not been able to hear David's rant, they would have been chatting with each other. It was a party, after all. They never said a word, but just stood there, frozen in place by what was happening, and heard every expletive. Imagine how that might play in Italy, where family is all important. It sure wasn't any longer to David. What must they have thought? Is this for real? Is this the head of Scientology? And is that his father? The poor pop star wasn't even a Scientologist. He had come purely as a favor. The church had paid his airfare, but that was it. And he had to stand for nearly an hour while David gave me an earful. The entire episode was shattering. The word terrible can't begin to describe how it felt. I don't even remember the excuse he used to come down on me, but it went on until I finally said, "Okay, I got it." At that point, he said, "Good, I was waiting to hear that from you." That is why I was going on for the last 55 minutes. And he turned and walked away. David and the church have always denied that he engages in demeaning or abusive conduct of this nature, but my experience plainly suggests otherwise. Afterward, his secretary, Laurice, called me into a room to do damage control. Now, look, Dave didn't mean everything he was saying out there, she told me, trying to smooth things over. That was a standard function of hers, to come behind David after he lost control, to try to patch things up. It did not matter what the reason was for his blow-up. The reasons came after the explosion, to rationalize why he lost control in the first place. The actual reason, I concluded after many more similar episodes, was that he enjoyed nullifying people, and that included even his father. Over time, I found the silver lining in these thunderclouds. If you were able to simply face the music and not react internally, but simply acknowledge the tirade, nothing would stick to you. And when it was over for you too. Apart from the occasional lightning strike, however, my early experiences at Gold were for the most part enjoyable. I really enjoyed working with Edgar on his Mission Earth album. Then in January 1986, L. Ron Hubbard died. The whole base went down to the Palladium in Los Angeles, where we were given the Shore story. In other words, a lie. That Hubbard had gone exterior. In other words, out of his body, to continue his research without the physical body's encumbrances. Several people spoke at the event, including David, Pat Broker, and Earl Cooley, a Boston lawyer who represented the church for years. David spoke first and announced Hubbard's passing, framing it by saying that Hubbard had done as much research as he could do in that body, had fully mapped the route to complete spiritual attainment for all Scientologists, and was now exterior, and would be continuing his research free from physical limitations. While some in the crowd may have been shocked or saddened at the news, at the end of David's presentation, wild applause greeted several photos of Hubbard that were shown on the auditorium screen. More applause followed Pat Broker's relaying of Hubbard's admonishment that there was to be no sorrow, no mourning, because Scientologists know they are spirits, not bodies. The audience thus prepared, Norman Starkey, another church executive, performed the Scientology funeral service. No one addressed the issue of whether anyone would succeed Hubbard. This was a drama that would play out over the next year or so. I attended the event and was assigned the task of acting as a bodyguard for Hubbard's son, Arthur. I drove him down to Los Angeles from the base and home afterward. On the way home, we stopped at a market, and Arthur bought something to eat. We got back to the base, and Arthur set his bag down outside the car while we chatted for a bit. We wandered a ways from the car and the bag. That turned out to be a mistake because a dog came out of nowhere, grabbed the contents of the bag, and began chowing down on a coffee cake, cellophane wrapper and all. About my earlier reference to a Shore story, this was something developed on the Apollo that people on the ship would tell the locals ashore about who they were and what they were doing. It was called telling an acceptable truth, which always boils down to a lie. If a Scientologist ever admits to using a Shore story, it means he is lying, pure and simple. For example, when the Apollo pulled into a new port, the Shore story was that those aboard were either management consultants or trainees who were gaining experience before returning to their companies. Strictly speaking, that was true. The people on board were managers. They were managing international Scientology. As well, students on board were learning Hubbard's latest developments in administrative technology, and some would eventually return to their organizations, though some also were recruited to join the Sea Org, and so never made it home again. When the Sea Org returned to land in Clearwater in 1975, Hubbard used a front group called Southern Land Developing and Leasing Corporation to buy the Fort Harrison Hotel for a tenant supposedly called United Churches of Florida. That was the Shore story. In other words, a lie. At any rate, a couple of days after the funeral in Los Angeles, Ray Mithoff, then the most senior technically trained person in the church, came to me to give me more information about the event. He said that before Hubbard died, the two of them had been talking, and Hubbard had asked Ray if he thought people would miss him. Ray said, probably so. Hubbard said they shouldn't, and at the end of their conversation he went into his room. A couple of hours later, he was gone. When someone tells you something that is true, it has the ring of truth to it. When something is only partially true, it has a different, somewhat hollow ring. And I knew even then that what Ray was telling me was bullshit. He had come to see me because Dave knew that I was gregarious and talked to a lot of people, and that if I bought that story and passed it on, people would tend to accept it. I never bought it, or passed it on. Another time I was up in David's office, which was located on the north side of the property overlooking the highway. We were discussing something or other, and while we were talking, the payroll person from David's organization, the Religious Technology Center, walked into the office and handed David his weekly pay in cash. Dave looked at it briefly, said thanks, and the guy walked out. Dave laid the money on the desk, and we continued our conversation. I could see the cash paper-clipped to the invoice, and it was the same allowance all staffers were receiving at the time. I think $30. Room and board were provided by the Sea Org, of course. I will bet you dollars to donuts that David staged that little interlude to get me to think that he was making the same as every other Sea Org member on the base. Again, he knew that I was gregarious and would tell people, "You know, COB, poor guy, he works so hard, but only makes the same pay as the rest of us." I never did. David holds the post of chairman of the board of the Religious Technology Center, and people refer to him as COB. That March at L. Ron Hubbard's annual birthday celebration 2 months after his death, a day that Scientology continues to celebrate as a holiday each year around his birthday, we released an album called Road to Freedom, performed by L. Ron Hubbard and friends. We had 30 days to produce the entire album, which was impossible, as anybody in the music business would confirm. Yet, on day 30 at 8:30 in the morning, 2 guys drove off the base to L.A. to make masters. It was conceived, written, arranged, recorded, and mixed in 1 month. We got no sleep for that month. David had demanded that the goal be met, and it was up to everyone else to do or die. We did, but nearly died in the process. Immediate arrangements were made with Scientology celebrities to contribute to the album. Since most were already in Los Angeles, it was only a matter of securing their agreement and then arranging for them to come to the base for their part of the production. These artists were there only when their parts were being recorded, of course. While they worked long hours when needed, they were spared the round-the-clock work put in by Sea Org members. Despite everything, I thoroughly enjoyed working with John Travolta, Julia McGinnis Johnson, the opera and cabaret singer, Chick Corea, David Campbell, Amanda Ambrose, the famed jazz singer, Michael Roberts, Frank Stallone, and other Scientology artists who came up to contribute to the effort. John was a wonderful person to work with. After we finished recording one of his songs for the album, I gave him a ride back to Los Angeles, and we had a nice conversation about nothing in particular. He used to call me Pops because I played trumpet, as did Louis Armstrong, and that was one of his nicknames. Frank, of course, is the younger brother of Sylvester Stallone. Frank was not a Scientologist, nor was Sly, but Frank had come to Portland to help with the protest in 1985. He was willing to contribute to the album, and so came on board. Julia McGinnis Johnson was another fabulous artist. What a voice! As a kid, she was in the Sea Org and was one of L. Ron Hubbard's stewards aboard the Apollo. But she decided she was going to become famous as a singer, and she left and did it. She has since had a long and successful career, mostly in Europe, as a mezzo-soprano in musical theater. In 1984, she starred in the film Carmen. The truth is that everyone on that project was great to work with. People pitched in because they wanted to honor L. Ron Hubbard. The album was wonderfully received by Scientologists when released that March, the first such event after Hubbard's death, which made it significant. Working with great people and creating good products helped me overlook the living conditions at the base, because we all were there to help make a better world. It wasn't horrible, but life in the Sea Org was no country club. I lived in a house on the property with some of the other single guys in the music department. Occasionally, every couple of weeks or so, I took a day of liberty, as it was called, and did whatever I wanted. In my early years, I took a vacation for a week or two each year. Christmas holidays were nice, with a few days off and a lot of group activities, great food, shows that we musicians put on, movies, and just relaxing with everybody on the base. Conditions, in other words, were tolerable. A tremendous number of diverse activities occurred on the base in those days. Golden Era Productions was charged with producing all the media for dissemination, training films, videos for PR purposes, Hubbard's lectures, not only in English but translated and recorded by voice talent in a variety of languages, occasional updates of Hubbard's books. In addition, the base facilities needed to be maintained and expanded, and the management units with offices there needed to be supplied with meals, housing, and other services. This required a large and multifaceted organization with many specialized units. People trained for their specialty, and spent their days contributing to the overall effort. Since I worked in the music department, I spent my days composing and arranging music that could be used in film or video productions. By this time, my daughters Denise and Lori had married, and I was now a grandfather. Denise's husband was a Scientologist, but Lori's never became more involved than taking some introductory courses. That was never an issue one way or the other. I visited them while on leave when they all were living in New Hampshire, and I truly enjoyed my grandkids. I would take them out in the woods because that was something I enjoyed as a kid. I taught them basic camping skills, such as how to build a fire, even in the rain, where to find dry wood, how to light it, that kind of thing. I taught them how to throw potatoes in the fire, cook hot dogs, common things that a granddad can show the young'uns. In 1988, the church held the maiden voyage for its new cruise ship, the Freewinds. It was a huge event, because on that first voyage from its home port in Curacao, they released the most advanced of the Scientology auditing levels, which is delivered only aboard the ship. From 1950 until the end of his life, Hubbard more or less continuously released new developments in Dianetics and Scientology. One of the last of these was an advanced auditing course that he said should be delivered off the crossroads of the world. In other words, in a distraction-free environment. The world had been out of his hair for most of the time he'd been at sea, and Scientology returned to sea with the Freewinds. Before we got to the launch, we musicians had been up for days, preparing music for the videos that would be shown during the week of events. We arrived dog-tired, but instead of sleeping, we were put to work, along with others, building the event stage. That was only the beginning. On that maiden voyage, the passengers, who were mostly high-roller Scientologists and celebrities, went to heaven. The rank-and-file Sea Org members went to hell. I had posh berthing, a deck chair in one of the offices. Other guys slept on the deck with a blanket. For one gig, we worked outdoors in the Caribbean heat until the moment we had to go to the venue for a sound check. We were sweating like pigs, went to the site, did the sound check, and headed back to the ship with just enough time to change into our stage outfits, no time to shower, and do the show. It was B.O. City. One thing to understand about the Sea Org, Hubbard and then David could sit in an office and think up groovy ideas to advance Scientology. Whether the resources to implement those ideas exist is another matter. Usually sufficient resources are not available to do things comfortably, so they get done uncomfortably. Often, because of rushed planning or slipshod execution, they have to be done over again a time or two or even more. Sea Org members become cynical after a few of these painful experiences and adopt the unwritten motto of the Sea Org: there is never time to do it right, but always time to do it twice. Every year after 1988, Scientology held another anniversary cruise, and every year it was the same thing. Stay up night after night to get everything ready, fly down to the ship, and stay up night after night doing shows during the cruise. Everything was done to impress influential Scientologists and to make David and management look good. As the years went on, management faded from the equation. More on that later. Each year the ship sailed to different ports in the Caribbean, and one year it sailed to Mexico. The musicians and some other staff members were going through immigration as a group, and 4 Mexican police were acting as gatekeepers. They spoke no English, and we spoke no Spanish. I tried to explain that we were coming to play music. They shook their heads no. They weren't going to let us into the country. This could have become a real disaster, but I got an idea. Guys, get out your horns, I said to the others. One guy took out his trombone. The next guy grabbed his clarinet, and I took out my trumpet, and we played Limehouse Blues. If you know the song, it is very up-tempo and jazzy. A couple of times I looked at the head guard and winked, and he winked back at me. They were smiling and tapping their feet to the tune, and when we finished, they applauded and gave us a thumbs up. We got through immigration by playing Limehouse Blues. One of the most wonderful people I met during these yearly cruises was Isaac Hayes, who had become involved in Scientology in the mid-1990s. Beyond his iconic stature in the music world and popular culture, Isaac was a person of great courage. During the Civil Rights era, Isaac was the first African American to go into a Walgreens in Memphis, Tennessee, in protest of the Jim Crow laws. Although he was a superstar when I met him, I found him to be a down-to-earth person and extremely humble. I remember sitting in his cabin sharing stories about our youth. Isaac came from a poor family, and when his high school class sold chocolate bars to raise money for their activities, Isaac lived on the chocolate bars for an entire month. Later, when he became famous and had money, he repaid the school for the bars. That is the kind of person he was. I told him about buying the Charles Atlas bodybuilding course when I was a kid. I had enough money for the down payment but could not afford to keep up with the monthly installments. I began receiving letters from the Atlas company demanding payment, and I was sure that any day I would be dragged off to jail. Finally, I hit on an idea to get them off my back. I wrote a letter directly to Charles Atlas himself, saying that I should not have to pay for the course, because my chest muscles were always sore from the exercises. Isaac could not stop laughing at that one. I once heard Isaac express his reason for being involved in Scientology. He wanted to help make a better world because he knew he was going to come back to it one day and wanted it to be a good place. Truly, Isaac was one of the nicest people I've ever known. Notwithstanding that chewing out I received at St. Hill, I have to say that my dealings with David were not bad during my early years at Gold, especially compared to later times. He had taken on the duty of giving final okay for many of the products that units on the base produced, and these included music scores for films, PR events, and so on. I often brought music submissions up to his office and went over them with him, and we got along well. Though he was now the leader of the church, he was still friendly with me, though our interactions became more formal and businesslike. One time he told me, "We don't believe in nepotism. The fact you're my father doesn't cut any ice around here." I accepted that. After all, I was pretty proud of him for all the things he had achieved. I would overlook some things and forgive a lot of things that maybe I shouldn't have. I have a hard time playing the victim, and a lot of stuff just went by me with a que sera attitude. An example might be his rejecting a piece of music I had arranged. "Jesus Christ, this is a piece of crap," he would say. "What are you guys doing down there?" Instead of, "Okay, here is what I had in mind, and here is where I think you went off the rails." A year or two after I joined, a talented musician named Peter Schless joined Gold. He had written the music for a big hit called "On the Wings of Love." The lyrics were by Jeffrey Osborne, who recorded it. Had played with the Allman Brothers and was an extremely competent professional. He and I worked together a lot over the years and produced a lot of music together. It was not easy to gain approval from David for film music. At times we would bust our guts to create something that worked, often staying up all night to try to get it right. The first time I was faced with an all-nighter, I wondered aloud about the wisdom of trying to work when dog-tired, and someone snapped at me, "If you don't like it, just go root out of the Sea Org." I learned to stay up all night, but always viewed it as a punishment rather than something noble. When you are tired, you cannot think straight. You make mistakes and usually create more trouble for yourself. One time, Peter Schless and I stayed up for 84 hours straight, doing music for a video. We wrote the theme, arranged it, and recorded all the parts, so it was a finished piece that fit exactly with the video. Then we crashed into bed, exhausted. We were proud that we got it done, but it was completely nuts. Any good times I had did not last, however. They do not last for anybody who is in David's orbit, as I have long since learned. In the mid-1980s, Gold built a state-of-the-art music recording studio. No expense was spared to make it as fine as any studio in the world. Walls were 2 feet thick to dampen any sound from the roadway 100 yards to the south. The studio was set on rubber plugs to separate it from the earth, further dampening vibrations. Lexan panels in the studio enhanced the sound. The theory behind its construction was to make it absolutely dead, meaning there would be no reverberation whatsoever in the studio. but reverb could be added after recording to make the music sound better for the particular venue where it would be played. The Massenburg Music Mixing Board was one of only 4 in the world. The studio also had conference rooms, facilities for visiting artists to use, a kitchen, you name it. It was really top of the line. A completely dead recording studio, besides being a near impossibility to create, was also a flawed concept to begin with, so David ordered several major overhauls of the entire facility. By 1987, he was the undisputed leader of Scientology, and his influence permeated everything at the base, and over time extended to the farthest reaches of Scientology internationally. These renovations often tied up large sections of the organization for weeks or months at a time, as people worked around the clock, replanning, renovating, and rewiring the whole place at a cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe even more. Each time was a worse nightmare than the previous effort. The modus operandi of these evolutions, as they were called, was punishment drive, which means coercing cooperation through punishment, or threats thereof. In truth, that is the way the Church of Scientology operates today, and that mentality exists solely because of David Miscavige. Here's an example of the degree to which it became institutionalized. One of David's henchmen, for there is no other term for this person, once was briefing the music department on something that needed to be done. "If you don't get this done, here's what's going to happen to you," he said, and proceeded to rattle off what awaited us for non-compliance. "Okay," I interjected, "that's the punishment. What's the reward if we get it done?" "The reward is you don't get punished," he said in all seriousness. L. Ron Hubbard wrote in numerous policies that punishment drive does not and has never worked. When a worker continues to toil under the threat of punishment, what actually impels the worker is his own willingness. It has nothing to do with punishment or its threat. But punishment drive is the way the church operates today. Punishment is preferable to any other motivation in its eyes. If he doesn't work, punish him. Put him on beans and rice. Hubbard once cut an offending person's rations to simple rice and beans, which he alleged provided a complete protein diet, yet it becomes awfully unappealing 3 times a day for days or weeks on end. David modified the concept of carrot and stick to stick first, last, and always. I recall talking with him one time about how to inspire people to accomplish things, and he said, "I'll tell you how to get work done. Kick their ass, man." In other words, dominate them. That flew in the face of my observations and experience with the vast majority of the people at Gold. They were willing to do just about anything to advance Scientology. They were the most willing people I ever met. In the midst of this misery, which would in time become much worse, a bright spot made it all worthwhile for me in the long run. For a time, Gold did internal promotions that involved sending some of the Gold crew down to the Los Angeles organizations, dressed as characters from the technical training films they produced. One of those films had an Alice in Wonderland theme, so people dressed up as the Mad Hatter, the Queen of Hearts, and other characters, and paraded around the organizations to drum up interest in the films. One character in particular caught my eye immediately. Alice, as played by Becky Bigelow, the daughter of Tom Bigelow, the race car driver. Becky grew up around racetracks, from midget cars in Wisconsin to the Speedway at Indianapolis, where Tom ran 9 times, and I soon figured out excuses to discuss business with her seniors in the marketing area where Becky worked. To my everlasting joy, my interest in her was reciprocated, and we have never looked back. I can now state unequivocally that I have experienced marriage from both ends of the spectrum. As stressful and traumatic as my marriage to Loretta was, my marriage to Becky has been really, really wonderful. Better than I could have imagined. In 25 years of marriage, I can count the number of serious arguments we have had on one hand, literally. That was a week of life with Loretta. I say that only to make the point that people who want different things from life, as Loretta and I did, have the deck stacked against them in a big way. A mongoose and a cobra should never be married. When I think about what Loretta and I put each other through, with the arguments and the fights and my striking her, it seems like another lifetime. I don't think I would even be capable of considering something like that now. If you are fortunate to have a wonderful relationship with someone like I have with Becky, here's my advice. Cherish it with everything you've got. Becky and I were granted a weekend off, just the two of us, and were married in Las Vegas in June 1990. Neither David nor any of my other kids or Becky's family attended. David used to joke with Becky about her being his stepmom, and he accepted the fact of our marriage. It is a good thing we wed when we did, because things were about to go steeply downhill for Gold. By the next month, our chances of getting hitched would have been zero for a long, long time. On August 10th, 1990, a torrential storm hit the Hemet Valley. It poured and poured, causing mudslides across State Route 79, the road that bisects the base. Meteorologists termed it a 100-year event. There were flash floods throughout the Hemet Valley, one of which caused water damage to some buildings on the base, including David's own quarters. A drain in front of his room clogged, and water seeped under the doors, soaking the carpet. His secretary had to unblock the drain herself, since everyone else was out dealing with the damage at the highway. After dinner that evening, David ordered the entire base to muster in the dining area, which was the only space large enough to accommodate everyone. He ordered the Gold staff to stand at the front, and he lashed out at us for half an hour, maybe even longer, ranting about how the damage was entirely our fault. He could brutalize a single individual verbally, which we all knew because nearly everyone had either experienced it personally or seen it done to others. On this occasion, though, he ramped up his intensity to a level none of us had seen before. The next day, the entirety of Gold was subjected to draconian measures, undoubtedly thought up by David himself. Because Gold was tasked with the maintenance and security of the base, he blamed the organization for what had happened. All privileges were revoked. Every Gold staff member was assigned a condition of confusion, meaning that our status as a group was considered well below zero, and we were forced to take part in a boot camp that was a travesty of the concept. It consisted of being dressed down regularly as a group by more of David's henchmen and marching around the base for hours on end. As someone who went through Marine boot camp and came out the other side a capable Marine, I can say that David's version was intended solely to nullify people, not to make them more competent. The whole crew was mustered up several times a day, and if anyone was late to a muster, the penalty was that the offending person had to stay up all that night working on some mundane task and go without sleep. Frankly, after that flood, life in the Sea Org became a downward spiral. Almost nothing we musicians did was considered worthy of approval. Eventually, the music department had to use classic rock songs in videos because we could not get a melody approved. And this became a bad scene indeed, when almost the entire base was mired in what we called event mode, which in short order became a runaway freight train.